These are two retirees who both saved $1 million. Both retired the same year at 65, and both walked away from their careers convinced they had done everything. Right? One of them runs out of money in their mid-70s. The other dies with more wealth than they started with. The difference between them isn't luck. It isn't their investments. And it isn't even how long they live. It is a 2% gap in how much they pulled from their portfolio every single year. Most personal finance content breezes past this concept, which is exactly the wrong move. A withdrawal rate is simply the percentage of your total retirement portfolio. You take out a year to live on. And if you have $1 million saved and pull out $40,000 in year 1, that is 4%. Pull out $60,000 and that is 6%. The math on the surface looks clean and simple, but what happens to that portfolio over 20, 25, 30 years is where things get complicated and where most people get blindsided long after it is too late to course correct. Here is something that almost nobody mentions when the 4% rule comes up in conversation. It didn't come from a bank. It was a marketing slogan from a brokerage firm, and no government agency issued it. One man built it, William Bengen, a financial planner who trained in aeronautics at MIT, and he published his findings in October 1994 in the Journal of Financial Planning. Bengen pulled us stock and bond market data, stretching all the way back to 1926. Tested every single 30-year retirement window he could find in that dataset, and asked one question: what is the highest withdrawal rate that would have survived very single one of those historical periods without zeroing out the portfolio? His answer landed at 4%, specifically for a portfolio split 50% in large cap US stock, ND 50% in intermediate term US government bonds, with that initial withdrawal adjusted every year to keep pace with inflation. And it held up for at least 30 years, not most of the time, not in favorable conditions, but across every historical window he could test. A few years later, in 1998, 3 professors at Trinity University in Texas, Cooley, Hubbard, and Walls, ran their own independent analysis on the same historical data and arrived at the same conclusion. And that study, known ever since as the Trinity Study, became the second pillar of everything modern retirement withdrawal planning is built on. The argument for a higher withdrawal rate deserves to be taken seriously, rather than dismissed, because the numbers behind it tell a real story. Retire at 65 with $1 million and pull out 4%. And you are living on $40,000 a year from your portfolio. Stack on the average Social Security benefit, which as of early 2025 sat at roughly $22,884 per year, according to the Social Security Administration. And total annual income lands at about $62,884. That works for a lot of people, but it doesn't feel like the retirement someone spent 40 years building toward, and it doesn't leave much room for travel, for helping adult kids, or for anything beyond a careful monthly budget. Bump the withdrawal rate to 6% and the picture changes. The same $1 million portfolio now throws off $60,000 a year. Combined Social Security pushes total income to roughly $83,000. And the difference between those two numbers is the difference between a vacation and a real trip, between maintaining a house and actually enjoying it. Michael Kitces, one of the most widely cited financial planners working today, has gone on record arguing that the 4% rule is frequently too conservative. His analysis of historical data shows that most retirees who stuck with 4% in just survived their retirement. They ended up with 2 to 3 times their original portfolio, still sitting there when they died, which raises a genuinely uncomfortable question about whether extreme caution in spending is actually serving people well or just leaving them with a very large inheritance they never intended to leave. The tension between security and actually living your retirement is real, and there is no clean answer that makes it disappear. Sequence of returns. Risk is the phrase that belongs at the center of every retirement withdrawal conversation, and it rarely gets there. What it describes is the fact that the order in which investment returns happen matters enormously during retirement, and 2 portfolios with the exact same average annual return over 30 years can produce completely opposite outcomes, depending entirely on whether the bad years cluster at the beginning or the end of that window. During the saving years, a terrible market doesn't destroy you. The portfolio drops. You keep contributing. You buy more shares at lower prices. The market recovers, and you come out fine. Retirement flips that dynamic completely. A 30% drop in year one of retirement means you are not buying anything at a discount. You are selling shares at the worst possible prices just to cover rent and groceries. And the portfolio never gets the chance to recover on its own terms. The numbers here are worth sitting with. $1 million portfolio suffers a 30% loss in year one, which brings it to $700,000. And keep in mind that a 30% drawdown is hypothetical. The S&P 500 lost roughly 49% during the dot-com bust from 2000 to 2002 and roughly 57% during the 2008 financial crisis. The 6% retiree pulls $60,000 out of that $700,000, leaving $640,000, and to simply tread water the following year, not grow, not recover, just stay flat. The portfolio now needs to return 9.4%. The 4% retiree pulls $40,000 instead, finishes year one with $660,000, and only needs a 6.1% return to stay flat. Both bars are high, but one of them is a steep climb and the other is a cliff face, and only one of them has historically proven survivable when bad years keep coming. The 1966 retiree is the stress test everyone should know about. That year kicked off a 16-year run where inflation averaged more than 7% annually, peaked at 13.5% in 1979, and equity markets went essentially nowhere. Inflation, adjusted withdrawals, grew in dollar terms every year, while the portfolio bled from poor market performance at the same time. The 4% withdrawal rate survived that window. The 6% rate did not. The Trinity Study put specific numbers on this, and they're worth knowing. For a 30-year retirement with a portfolio of 75% stocks and 25% bonds, a 4% withdrawal rate produced a roughly 98% historical success rate, meaning nearly every 30-year window in the data ended with the portfolio still intact, moved to 5%, and that rate drops to around 80%, which means a real failure rate starts appearing. At 6%, the success rate falls to approximately 68%, and that translates to roughly 1 in 3 retirees historically running out of money before the 30 years were up. Now factor in how long retirements actually run. The Social Security Administration estimates that a 65-year-old woman today lives on average to around 87, and a couple both age 65 carries roughly a 50% chance that at least one of them makes it past 90. Bengen. So research was built around a 30-year horizon, but retire at 55 and the math shifts entirely. Some research puts the safe withdrawal rate for a 40-year horizon at just 3.3% to 3.5%, not 4%, and nowhere close to 6%. The number that works for a 65-year-old retiree with a 30-year runway can fail badly for someone with a 40-year runway, and that distinction almost never makes it into the conversation. Bengen built the 4% rule entirely on us, historical data, and the United States holds arguably the most successful equity market track record in recorded financial history, applying a rule derived from that specific data set to portfolios with heavy international exposure or assuming future US performance mirrors its own historical average, carries risks the original research never accounted for. Starting valuations complicate things further. Robert Shiller, the economist who developed the CAPE ratio, which measures how expensive the stock market is relative to long runnings history, showed that retiring into a highly valued market connects consistently to lower returns over the following decade. As of late 2024, the US CAPE ratio was running in the range of roughly 34 to 38, a reading that has historically preceded periods of muted returns. And that doesn't guarantee a crash, but it does mean the tailwinds that made the 4% rule work so reliably through much of the 20th century may not be blowing as hard for people retiring right now. The inflation question has also refused to stay theoretical. When US inflation hit a 40-year peak of 9.1% in June 2022, Bengen himself gave interviews acknowledging that the conditions which test his rule aren't buried in the past. He had originally suggested that including small cap stocks in the portfolio mix could push the safe rate to 4.5%. But the 2022 inflation spike was a reminder that the exact pressures his 1966 worst case scenario was built around can come back without much warning. No single number works for every person in every situation, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. The 4% rule works as a starting point, a floor for thinking about what is safe, not a ceiling on what is possible. Retire into a strong early bull market. Watch the portfolio grow meaningfully in the first several years, and with the ability to reduce spending during downturns. There is legitimate historical room to spend well above 4% and never face a crisis. But retire at 55, step into elevated market valuations, carry no flexibility in monthly spending, and hold no supplemental income from Social Security or a pension, and 6% carries a failure rate that history refuses to make look comfortable. Not certain failure. Roughly 1 in 3 historical failures. And in retirement, there is no recovery round. The single most protective behavior, beyond the percentage itself, is building flexibility into how withdrawals work. Retirees who get through bad sequence of returns events share one common trait. They could pull back on spending during a market downturn, rather than being locked into a fixed dollar amount, regardless of what the market was doing that year. 2 retirees, same $1 million, same retirement year. The one pulling 6% lives better in the good years. More freedom, more spending, more of what 4 decades of work was supposed to buy. But if the market runs rough in that first decade, historical data puts that person's LU rate at roughly 1 in 3. And when a retirement portfolio fails, there is no reset, no second chance at the accumulation phase, and no undoing the damage that compounding withdrawals, a declining portfolio, causes. The 4% rule is T-perfect. It is conservative. It leans heavily on American historical data, and it leaves many retirees sitting on far more than they needed to, but it has survived every worst case scenario researchers have found, including the 16-year inflation and stagnant market window that began in 1966 and didn't release its grip until the early 1980s. Understanding the difference between these two numbers before retirement begins, the kind of math that doesn't get a second chance to matter.